Welcome, Gunrunner.
When it comes to consoles from the early part of the second generation, which was the first to introduce consoles that used ROM cartridges, we all know about the Atari 2600, Philips Video Pack and Mattel Intellivision. But there are also quite a few consoles that people never really talk about, like the Bally Astrocade, APF Imagination Machine and the Advanced Programmable Video System. Now in most cases it's because those consoles didn't sell very well. But in the case of the latter, which is the subject of this very video of course, that's not really true, as it actually sold rather well from what we know about it. But that's the problem, its incredibly confusing history means we just don't know enough, and I should probably explain that issue in a little bit more detail. In many ways the APVS is like a console version of the MSX, a common console standard that could be licensed to different manufacturers around the world to create their own versions. Nobody is entirely sure who created the first version of the hardware, but it's thought that Hong Kong company Radofin were behind the final design, with the first versions of the console being released in 1978 by Radofin themselves and Dutch company Audiosonic, which itself is interesting as the console used a Signetics processor to power it, a company owned by Philips, meaning they were effectively competing with themselves. The issue was that as more companies started producing their own versions of the hardware, they started making slight changes, whether that be to the size of the cartridges, controllers, or the name of the system itself. This meant that cartridges from one version of the APVS might not fit in another, and with the various name changes, it wasn't even obvious what consoles were part of the APVS range. Aside from Radofin, the largest producers of the console were Acetronic in the UK and Interton in Germany, who both used their own name for it. In total there were over 20 different manufacturers, hence the confusion. Between 1978 and 1980 there were 59 different games produced for the hardware, but not all games were available on all versions of the hardware. However, the Interton VC4000 has the largest game selection of all, and is thought to be the best selling model in the range too. So for that reason, the 10 games I'm about to cover might not work on your specific console if you're lucky enough to own one, but you can always fire up an emulator to try them out. I myself own an Acetronic MPU-1000, and I've linked my video on that in the description for those interested. Now before we start, I should add a caveat, because usually when I do an exclusives video, we get a decent selection of unique and often original games that very much benefit owners of the console. But in the case of the APVS, the vast majority of its library is clones of other people's games, which made picking out some decent titles to show quite a bit harder. But I think that most of these have their own little quirks that make them interesting, and hopefully you'll find this rather strange console as fascinating as I did.
Earth family, at leisure.
You won!
Hanimex Video System. Incredible range of cartridges. Show us this game.
Sure. It's a Hanimex video computer game. They've got lots of them. Hanimex. Leisure makers to planet Earth.
Hanimex. Leisure makers to planet Earth.
Okay, I'm going to start with a really obvious clone that isn't remotely original, but given Space Invaders is a classic game, and the title that launched the Atari 2600 into the stratosphere, it seems only right to see what this unofficial version has to offer. So straight away you'll notice that this version looks fairly different, with the aliens spaced out around the screen rather than being in fixed rows, but they still descend down the screen in the same manner. You still have those handy bases to hide behind, although they're shaped differently here and also destroyed quite differently too, but yes, your mission is still exactly the same, to destroy all the aliens before they reach the bottom. This version of the game feels a lot less urgent and quite a bit easier too, probably due to the lack of processing power in this console. But it still plays fairly well. There's also a 2-player mode too, albeit one where you take it in turns. So in summary, Invaders certainly isn't original, and really isn't unique to the console either, but it still plays a fairly decent version of the Taito arcade classic, especially for such limited hardware, making it a game worth owning if you have an APVS in your collection. games are featured in many of my Amazing Facts episodes so far. Off the top of my head, I'll certainly put them in my videos on the Sega SG-1000, Atari Jaguar, Vectrex, TI-99-4A, 3DO, Philips Videopack and Bally Astrogate, and I pretty much knew before I even started researching this video that APVS Pinball would feature here. In fact, it was the first title I wrote down on my list. Also known as Arcade under the Voltmace branding, this is a fairly simple effort for the most part with just a single table, but it's fairly well featured with 6 big bumpers, mini bumpers, spinning wheels and either a double or single set of flippers depending on what mode you choose to play it on. It's also fast moving with fairly decent ball physics and it records your high score. The graphics are nice and colourful and it swaps these around depending on what mode you choose and also has very good sound effects. Well, good for an APVS game anyway. I mean, compare it to Video Pinball on the Atari 2600 and it certainly seems more advanced and looks a lot more like a real pinball table too. As the only pinball game on the system and a playable game in its own right anyway, it's pretty much a default purchase for the APVS. I suppose that in some ways you could describe Hyperspace as the APVS's answer to Star Raiders, even if it doesn't initially look like it, because whilst Atari's game was a first-person pseudo 3D affair, Hyperspace is a 2D third-person space shooter instead. But much of the concepts are very similar, as you have to guide your ship through each sector, destroying the enemy ships, and then docking with the mothership to recharge your energy when needed. You have 9 different sectors that are colour coded to show if you completed them, or if there is a mothership there, then we have some quite impressive warp sequences to please the eyes, and remarkably advanced gameplay for an APVS game. Your ship can move around the screen with full 360-degree movement and shoot in any direction too, but all the enemies shoot back at you, so you can't stay still for long. I mentioned the cool warp sequences, but the visuals in general are very good here, if a bit flickery at times, and I was impressed by the sound effects too. I don't think there's much doubting that Hyperspace is one of the best games on the system, and it's probably the most original game I've come across too. Always need a racing game on one of these lists, and Car Races is the best one I've come across for the APVS, especially as it's actually 3 games in one, with each one also having a 2-player variation too. The first of these is a lot like a top-down version of Enduro from the 2600, where you're trying to pass as many cars as possible before your time runs out. This is especially good for the second player as it splits the screen vertically and sees you competing to pass the most cars. The second variation is clearly inspired by Atari's Night Driver, as you speed down a slalom-like course trying not to hit the sides of the road. This is a lot harder than Atari's game though, with a lot less space to move and some really evil turns. The last game is another rip-off of a classic Atari creation in Sprint, being a very traditional top-down racer. This one really needs to be played against a friend, as it's a bit boring on your own. The graphics and sound aren't the best of this particular cartridge, but with all those different game variations to get through, it has absolutely tons of playability. Target shooting games were an early staple of video games in both the arcades and on home systems, that eventually morphed into the light gun games and titles of today like Big Buck Hunter. And there is a reason I mentioned that game in particular, because hunting for the APVS is very much its ancestor. It might seem like a pretty simple affair, but there was one thing in particular that impressed me here, and that's the sheer amount of different game variations on offer. No less than 64 of them in fact. The basic game is the same: use your hunter to shoot down birds, blast away bunnies and destroy ducks amongst other innocent creatures and go for the high score. But there are a surprising amount of different ways you can do this, including limited movement, controllable bullets, ricochets, time limited and various speed settings, as well as 2-player versions of each one. All of these different game variations help elevate an otherwise pretty generic title to a higher level and gives you much more to come back to. The nice visuals also help with the appeal of Hunter 2. I was also quite surprised to learn that this one has become a bit of a favourite on the Retro Achievements website, where the competition is pretty fierce. The very last game released for the Interton VC4000, Hyperspace, is also one of the largest in ROM size too, a massive 4K, and one of the most technically impressive games I've seen. Essentially, this is the console's answer to Defender, and shares a great deal in common with the Williams arcade classic. It certainly looks very similar, it's a horizontally scrolling shooter where you can fly in both directions, has similar enemies, and also very similar protection based gameplay. But rather than stopping hapless humans from being abducted, you're trying to stop weapons factories being bombed. If all of these are destroyed or your ship gets blown up, it's game over, and that last part is interesting. This is because your ship has a shield. If you get hit once, you change to yellow. Then if you get hit again, you turn white. If you are shot again whilst white, you die. However, if you hold out for a while, your shield will recharge. There's no scanner here like Defender, however it does alert you if a building is getting hit by flashing up a number that refers to the factory under attack, though this isn't massively helpful. Superspace looks and sounds fantastic for an APVS title, and is easily one of its best games. I always try to put at least one sports game on these exclusives lists, not just because I want to feature as many different genres as possible, but also because I think that old sports games get far too much hate these days. Sure, a lot of them are terrible, but there are still some good ones. I picked out Boxing Match not just because it's playable, but also because it can count as a fighting game too, a genre that people do love. Also known as Prize Fight, depending on what version of the APVS you have, this is a 2-player only game unfortunately, so unless you have some retro gaming inclined friends, it's a bit pointless. But let's look past that for a moment because this title has some really impressive features. Firstly, there is a rather surprising rendition of Eye of the Tiger for the Rocky films that plays before you get started, which is easily the best music I've heard on the APVS. Then you have the clever little captions that pop up as the fighters are pummeled into the mat. Lastly, there is the range of different punches and blocks that are available, not something you really saw in boxing games at this time. If you can find somebody else to play it with, then you'll get a lot of joy out of Boxing Match. The name of this one might lead you to believe that it's just a rip-off of the 2600 game with the same name, and given so many APVS titles were indeed just that, you'd be excused for reaching that conclusion. But this is actually a clone of a totally different game, Sega's Depth Charge. The basic gameplay here is exactly the same as the late 70s title that was succeeded by Deep Scan. Move your ship left and right along the ways, dropping depth charges to blow up the submarines and try to destroy as many as you can before your time runs out. However, there are a few small tweaks and changes to make it a bit more interesting. Firstly, there are several difficulty modes, and secondly, there are 2-player variations that see you competing against a friend for the highest score. One thing that really surprised me about the APVS is just how many games there are that allow 2 people to play at the same time. I've always been a fan of this title since playing Deep Scan as the hidden game on Die Hard Arcade for the Sega Saturn, and Air Sea Battle is a good version of the classic that adds some extra long-term playability thanks to the extra game modes and variations that it offers. We already had Invaders, and now we have Super Invaders, which you would assume is some sort of sequel, but I'm not so sure because they play quite differently. Unlike the other game, this isn't a complete rip-off of somebody else's, and seems to borrow ideas from several different titles, meaning it actually feels pretty fresh and original. In the game you control a gun turret trying to stop an alien invasion. A large mothership moves across the screen above you, dropping drone ships that fly down to the planet's surface to build a landing pad for the mothership. You need to both try and stop the drones and also destroy the mothership, and there are several ways of doing this. You can guide your missiles into both the drones and the mothership, but you can only hit the latter when its shields are down, shown by it turning purple. Doing this also destroys a section of the landing pad if any have been built. Hit the mothership enough times and it explodes, but another one soon comes along, so that's not where your mission ends. The single player game is already excellent here, but there's also a 2-player co-op mode where you get to compete for the top score, and that's absolutely superb. Known as either Spider's Web or Monster Man depending on what version of the console you have, this has to be my favourite game for the system, which is why I saved it until last. And I know what you're thinking, but this is just another lame Pac-Man clone, right? Well, it might look like one at first, but it actually isn't, although the APVS does have a couple of those, and I'll explain why. First of all, there are no dots to eat here. The main objective in Monster Man is to eat all the lovely fruit and other snacks that randomly appear around the screen whilst trying to stay alive. But you're not the only hungry one, because some nasty monsters are too. However, they aren't interested in eating the fruit, they want to eat you instead. Unlike Pac-Man, you never actually complete a maze, you just keep going as long as you can, trying to score as many points as possible. The monsters are mostly pretty dumb, as long as you don't get too close, and if you do they will chase you, but there's a way of turning the tables which is definitely like Pac-Man. If you eat one of the green fruit you can eliminate the enemies, but you only have 5 seconds to do this, so you'll have to be quick. Monster Man is such a fun game, and that's probably why I keep on coming back to it.
you looking at TV games? Then check these facts on Database. For further details and your nearest stockist, call Hitchin 894410. Say.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Advanced Programmable Video System exclusives. Can you think of any other one-off titles that only ever came out for this obscure 8-bit console? Or do you think some of these games were unworthy of inclusion? I also love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Dee Vaughan, Albert Davis, Richard Baker, Martin Wiggins, Peter Grantham, Bernard Santu, Mins, Classic Gamer 74, Josh Hartman, Daniel Skronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitson, Grady Haynes, Paul Daniels, Seth A. Robinson, Climatorn, Carl Olsen, Mark Strickland, Big Chuswell, Cole Cloping, Black Siren, John Albarino, Krispy Kreme, Justin Cooney, Luke Boynton, Sarah B., Richard Tate, Tailboy 2011, Tiago Silva, James Welch, Wesley K, Glacier 9, Cellphone Smartphone, Timu Maki, Marco, Hunter Bungay, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, then you can now join as a member for as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates, and much more besides. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.